The shamed Omega was abandoned. The Viking Alpha King saw the Omega's soul. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Moore had learned how to stand still when the world decided she did not belong, how to keep her shoulders level even when every whisper tried to bend her spine, and tonight, beneath the long timber beams of the northern hall, she felt that lesson settle into her bones like winter. The celebration had been planned for weeks, a gathering meant to unite packs across frozen valleys and rocky shores. But Elena stood at the far edge where torchlight thinned and warmth faded, her breath turning pale in the cold air that hovered near 40 degrees Fahrenheit. She was an Omega, and worse in their eyes, she was an Omega who had been shamed. When the announcement came earlier, spoken without cruelty yet heavy with finality, it left her alone among faces that suddenly found other places to look. The sound of laughter rolled on like waves hitting stone, measured in heartbeats and drum taps, while Elena counted steps in her mind as if distance could protect her, 1 foot, then another, the polished floor stretching like a mile she had to cross without stumbling. She did not cry. She had promised herself that long ago. Her hands stayed calm at her sides, fingers warm despite the chill, because dignity was the one thing they could not take unless she gave it away. Outside, the wind carried the clean scent of pine and salt, reminding her of nights when she walked the ridge trails alone, 5 miles of quiet where the stars felt closer and judgment felt smaller. Inside, the elders spoke of alliances and strength, of bloodlines and banners, and Elena listened without being seen, abandoned not by the moon, but by those who claimed to serve it. Then the hall shifted, not with noise, but with pressure, like a storm building miles out at sea. Doors opened wide, hinges sighing, and a presence entered that made the fire seem steadier and the air feel charged. King Ragnar Hale, the Viking Alpha King, stepped forward with a calm that commanded space rather than demanded it, his bearing simple, his gaze unhurried, the kind of authority that measured worth without spectacle. He did not scan the crowd for flattery or favor. He did not count names or titles. His eyes traveled, slowed, and stopped where Elena stood, half-lit and unclaimed, and in that moment the hall seemed to narrow to a single line drawn between them. He saw her not as the room described her, not as the words that had been placed on her like weights, but as something whole and steady beneath the noise. Elena felt it like a hand placed gently between her shoulders, a recognition that did not ask permission and did not promise anything it could not keep. The drums softened. Conversations thinned. She lifted her chin, not to seek him, but because she refused to disappear, and as the firelight flickered, the Viking Alpha King saw the Omega's soul, clear as frost under a rising moon, and the night held its breath. Elena felt the weight of that gaze long after it settled, not heavy like judgment, but steady, as if something unseen had found its balance. She did not move toward him, and he did not summon her, yet the space between them changed, measured now in intention rather than distance. Around her, the hall resumed its careful breathing, voices returning softer than before, cups raised with practiced smiles, but the warmth no longer reached her skin. She knew the rules well enough to understand what came next. An Omega without a bond, one publicly set aside, was expected to leave quietly, to make herself small so the celebration could continue without discomfort. Elena accepted that expectation without surrendering to it. She stepped away from the torchlit edge and walked toward the side doors, counting her steps again, 40 feet to the threshold, another 20 to the outer air, her boots steady on the wood worn smooth by generations who had passed through stronger and weaker than she was tonight. Cold met her face as she pushed the door open, the night hovering near 38 degrees Fahrenheit, clean and sharp, the stars scattered wide like they had room to breathe. She paused there, just long enough to let the silence collect her thoughts, just long enough to remind herself that being abandoned did not mean being empty. Behind her, voices shifted again, names whispered with curiosity now instead of dismissal, because the Alpha King had looked at her, and that alone changed the shape of things. Elena did not turn back. She stepped outside and pulled her cloak closer, walking down the packed earth path that curved away from the hall toward the pines. Each step carried her farther from the noise and closer to the truth she had always known, that her worth had never belonged to the room she left behind. She had gone nearly a quarter mile when she sensed it again, not footsteps, not pursuit, but attention, the kind that did not rush. Ragnar Hale remained inside the hall, yet his awareness followed her like a tide guided by the moon. He listened to the elders speak in careful tones, to alliances weighed like coin, to polite excuses offered for her departure, and he heard what was not said more clearly than what was. They spoke of shame as if it were contagious, of order as if it required silence, and Ragnar felt the familiar distance open between his crown and their comfort. He had crossed oceans and frozen ground to stand in that hall, but it was the Omega who had walked out that drew the true line of the night. When he finally moved, it was not with ceremony. He did not call guards or clear a path. He stepped away from the firelight and followed the corridor that led to the side doors, his pace unhurried, his presence calm. Outside, the wind carried the sound of Elena's footsteps fading into the trees, a soft rhythm that spoke of resolve rather than retreat. Ragnar stopped beneath the eaves, letting the cold bite his breath, measuring the moment not in seconds but in meaning. He did not intend to chase her, and he did not intend to command her return. What he intended was recognition, the kind that respected choice. Elena reached the tree line and rested her palm against the bark of a tall pine, grounding herself, feeling the slow strength that lived beneath the surface. She did not know if the Alpha King would follow, and she did not need to. No, what mattered was that someone had seen her clearly, not as a role or a mistake, but as a soul that had stood unbroken. In that knowledge, the night felt less cold, the path ahead less uncertain, and the distance between abandonment and belonging began to shift, quiet and inevitable, like the tide turning under a watchful moon. Elena stayed with the trees until the sounds of the hall dissolved completely, until the wind through needles replaced the careful voices she had left behind. She followed the narrow trail she knew by heart, the one that ran along the ridge for nearly 2 miles before dipping toward the frozen creek, her breath steady, her thoughts quieter than they had been all night. The ground held firm beneath her boots, packed and familiar, and she welcomed the honest resistance of earth compared to the fragile balance she had walked inside the hall. She stopped where the trail widened and the moonlight spilled through an opening in the branches, a pale silver that rested on her hands and reminded her that the sky had not changed its mind about her. She loosened her cloak and let the cold air touch her face, not as punishment, but as clarity, because she needed to remember who she was when no one else was watching. Inside the hall, King Ragnar Hale remained just beyond the doors, listening to the night as much as the words behind him. The elders offered him wine and apologies in equal measure, but he declined both with a courtesy that ended the discussion without offense. He was not interested in reassurance. He was interested in truth, and he had found it not in the center of the room, but at its edge. When he stepped into the cold, the temperature pressed against his lungs and sharpened his focus, the way it always had during long nights at sea. He did not follow the path loudly, and he did not rush. He respected distance because distance revealed intention. Elena sensed him before she saw him, a calm presence rather than a demand, and she turned slowly, meeting him beneath the open sky. They stood perhaps 30 feet apart, the space between them filled with moonlight and quiet, and neither of them broke it at first. Ragnar spoke only when he was certain the words would land where they belonged. He did not ask her why she left, and he did not apologize for the hall. He said her name once, Elena Moore, not loudly, not softly, simply correctly, and the sound of it settled like an anchor. She answered without lowering her eyes, because she had nothing to hide from someone who had not tried to claim her. He told her he had watched the room and found it wanting, that a pack which could not recognize steadiness mistook noise for strength. He did not offer protection, and he did not offer promises. He offered acknowledgement, which felt rarer. Elena listened, her shoulders easing as she realized he was not there to move her like a piece on a board. She told him she would not return to be examined or corrected, that whatever path she walked next would be her own. Ragnar nodded as if she had confirmed something he already knew. He said the North respected those who chose themselves without bitterness, and that the moon favored those who remained whole under pressure. He asked if she intended to keep walking. She said yes, because stillness would only pull her back toward old expectations. He did not stop her. He matched her pace instead, leaving a respectful distance, the kind that allowed choice to breathe. They walked for nearly half a mile without speaking, the night unfolding around them, the creek murmuring somewhere below, the stars steady overhead. In that shared silence, Elena felt the shape of abandonment soften into something else, something closer to release. Ragnar felt it too, a quiet certainty forming without force. When they reached the bend where the trail split, he paused and let her decide. She turned toward the lower path, the one that led to shelter and rest, and he inclined his head, accepting her direction as an invitation rather than a summons. Together, without ceremony and without retreat, they continued into the night, not bound by titles or expectations, but guided by a recognition that had already done its work. The path narrowed as the trees thickened, and Elena felt the quiet settle deeper, not as emptiness but as relief, the kind that arrives when expectation loosens its grip. They reached a low cabin set back from the creek, a place used by travelers during winter crossings, its windows dark but intact, the roof carrying a light dusting of frost. That caught the moon. Elena paused at the threshold, considering the shelter without asking permission, and Ragnar waited, hands relaxed at his sides, letting her decide what comfort meant. She opened the door and the familiar scent of wood and old fire greeted them, clean and simple, and she stepped inside first, claiming the space by presence rather than ownership. Ragnar followed at a respectful distance, setting aside the authority he carried like a cloak and entering as a guest. Inside, the temperature hovered near 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sharpen thought but not to threaten it, and Elena lit a small lamp with practiced ease, the flame steady, refusing to flicker under the draft. They took seats opposite one another at the small table, not close, not far, the room holding them without pressure. Ragnar spoke of the North not as conquest but as endurance, of long winters that taught patience and seas that rewarded steadiness, and Elena listened, recognizing herself in the spaces between his words. She shared little of her past, only what mattered, the work she had done, the trail she knew, the way silence had always been kinder than crowds. Ragnar did not pry. He listened as if her restraint itself were an answer. Outside, the creek whispered, measured and constant, and time slowed into something useful. After a while, Ragnar asked a single question, whether she believed belonging was chosen or given. Elena considered the flame, the way it drew breath from the room without asking, and said belonging was built, one decision at a time, and never owed. Ragnar smiled then, not with triumph but with recognition, and said the strongest halls were raised by those who stayed whole while building them. He told her he would return to the gathering at first light, not to explain her absence, but to correct a misunderstanding, and he made it clear he would not speak for her. He would speak to the room about itself. Elena felt the familiar instinct to refuse help rise, then settle, because he was not offering to carry her weight, only to clear a path she had already chosen to walk. She agreed to nothing and promised nothing, and the agreement felt honest. When the lamp burned low, Ragnar stood and moved toward the door, pausing only to say that whatever she decided next would be met without surprise. Elena nodded, accepting the night for what it was, a turning rather than a conclusion. He stepped out into the cold, and the quiet took his place, and Elena remained by the table, letting the warmth gather where it would. She lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the creek until sleep found her without argument. Dawn came pale and slow, the sky lightening inch by inch, and Elena woke with the certainty that the day would test her resolve rather than her worth. She rose, straightened the room, and stepped outside as the first birds called, the air crisp, the horizon clear. From the ridge, the hall stood distant, its smoke rising in thin lines, and Elena felt no pull to hurry. Somewhere beyond the trees, Ragnar Hale would speak with the calm that unsettled rooms accustomed to noise, and whether the hall listened or not would reveal more than any apology. Elena turned toward the lower path and began to walk, steady and unclaimed, carrying with her the knowledge that being seen had not changed who she was, but it had changed what others would have to face when they looked at her again. Morning stretched fully across the valley by the time Ragnar returned to the hall, the frost retreating from the ground as sunlight climbed, and the gathering reconvened with a careful energy that had not been there the night before. Elena walked the lower path along the creek at an unhurried pace, listening to water slide over stone, measuring her steps by breath rather than destination, because she had learned that calm was a choice she could make even when others watched. The hall filled again with leaders and elders, and when Ragnar took his place, he did not stand at the center. He waited, letting the room settle into itself, and only then did he speak, his voice even, neither raised nor softened, a sound that asked for attention without demanding it. He spoke of the night not as a spectacle but as a mirror, of how gatherings revealed what a people valued when pressure arrived, and he said that strength did not come from excluding what made a room uncomfortable. The words moved through the space like clear air, and faces shifted as recognition set in, some with relief, some with resistance. He did not name Elena, and he did not need to. He spoke instead of an Omega who had walked away with dignity intact, and of a hall that had mistaken order for silence. He said that the North was built by those who could see a steady soul and choose not to break it, and that alliances meant nothing if they taught people to abandon their own. The elders listened because they recognized authority when it arrived without anger. Outside, Elena reached the bend where the creek widened, the water bright and moving, and she paused to rest a hand against the railing of a small footbridge, feeling the vibration of the current travel up through the wood. She had not planned to return, and she did not plan to hide. She planned to continue, and that clarity felt like a quiet promise kept. Voices carried faintly across the valley, and she could not hear the words, only the change in tone, the way a room rearranged itself when certainty entered without force. Ragnar concluded without applause, and when questions came, he answered them briefly, not to persuade but to clarify, reminding the room that respect was not a favor but a standard. He left then, not to follow Elena, but to let the message stand on its own. Elena crossed the bridge and continued along the trail, sunlight warming the air into the low 50s, her pace easy. She sensed him again before she saw him, not close, not pressing, simply present at the edge of awareness, and she did not stop. Ragnar matched the distance he had kept before, honoring the space she had chosen, and when he spoke, it was to share information rather than intent. He told her the hall would not repeat the mistake quickly, that conversations had shifted and would continue to do so without her being required to return. Elena acknowledged this with a nod, accepting the change without claiming credit for it. She said she would be traveling for a time, following the water south where the land opened and the paths were less known, because movement helped her think. Ragnar said the sea would carry him west by nightfall, and that the North would remember the lesson whether it liked it or not. They walked together for another stretch, the trail straightening, the valley widening, neither of them reaching for what had not been offered. When they reached a fork where the ground rose toward the ridge and fell toward the open lowlands, they stopped. Ragnar thanked her for the clarity she had brought to a crowded room without ever entering it, and Elena thanked him for speaking without trying to own the truth he had seen. They did not exchange vows or plans. They exchanged recognition, which felt sturdier. Elena turned toward the lowlands, the sun bright on her path, and Ragnar turned toward the ridge, the wind steady at his back. As they parted, the distance did not feel like loss. It felt like the space required for something honest to grow, unhurried and unclaimed, under a sky that had room for both. Days passed with the measured rhythm of travel, and Elena found a comfort in the routine that steadied her thoughts, the way mornings opened with light, near 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and afternoons warmed just enough to ease her shoulders as she followed the creek south. She camped where the ground rose gently, choosing places that offered both view and shelter, and she spoke little, not because words failed her, but because silence continued to tell the truth without interruption. Along the way, she encountered small signs of the change Ragnar had set in motion, not declarations or apologies, but glances held a moment longer, greetings offered without appraisal, doors left open where they might have closed before. News traveled faster than she did. carried by traders and messengers who spoke of a hall unsettled by calm words and a king who refused to accept comfort at the cost of dignity. Elena did not claim any of it. She simply noticed. One afternoon, near a bend where the water spread into a shallow, clear pool, she met a group of travelers resting beneath cottonwoods. They recognized her, not with awe, but with respect, and asked if the path ahead was clear. She answered honestly and moved on, feeling the quiet affirmation settle into her steps. Far to the west, Ragnar prepared for the sea, overseeing final checks with the same unhurried attention he gave to people. He listened to reports without interrupting and corrected only what mattered, trusting steadiness over display. When questions arose about the Omega who had walked away, he answered with restraint, saying only that a people revealed themselves by whom they ignored. The ships were readied by late afternoon, the air holding near 60 degrees, the wind favorable, and as the tide shifted, Ragnar stood at the prow and watched the horizon widen. He did not look for Elena, and yet he felt the line of her path like a compass bearing, not pulling, simply present. On the third evening, Elena reached a crossroads marked by weathered signs and a small trading post, the kind that lived by passing stories more than goods. She stopped for water and listened as voices spoke of alliances rebalanced and elders reconsidering long-held habits. No one mentioned her name, and that felt right. She slept lightly that night, dreams uncomplicated, and woke with the sense that the tension she had carried for years had finally loosened its hold. At dawn, a message found her without ceremony, delivered by a courier who offered it with the neutrality of someone used to carrying truths without dressing them up. The note was brief and unadorned, written in a steady hand, acknowledging her direction and wishing her clear paths. There was no request and no promise, only recognition, and Elena folded it carefully and placed it with her map. She continued south, choosing the lower trail where fields opened and the sky seemed wider, and she noticed how easily she breathed. Meanwhile, the sea took Ragnar farther from shore, the coastline thinning into a pale line, and he felt a satisfaction not rooted in possession but in alignment. He spoke with his captains about routes and weather, then stood alone as evening settled, the temperature dipping toward the high 40s, the stars beginning to show. He considered the lesson the hall had offered and accepted it without regret, knowing that authority earned by clarity endured longer than control demanded by fear. As night deepened, Elena walked beneath a sky crowded with stars, the road firm beneath her boots, and she realized that the question she once carried about where she belonged had changed shape. It was no longer a plea for acceptance, but a choice she made with each step. Somewhere beyond hills and water, Ragnar guided his course by the same sky, not converging, not retreating, but moving in parallel, and the space between them felt purposeful, a promise not of reunion, but of respect that did not require proximity to remain true. Elena reached a town where the river widened and slowed, the air hovering. Near 65 degrees by midday, the streets busy with ordinary life that neither knew nor cared about the hall she had left behind. She found work easily, not because of whispers, but because she offered steadiness, and steadiness was always needed. Days arranged themselves into a pattern of morning light and evening rest, and with each passing hour, she felt the old tension release further, like a knot patiently untied. She noticed how people met her eyes without weighing her, how conversations stayed practical and kind, and how belonging grew from contribution rather than permission. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low and gray, she helped a shopkeeper move crates before the rain arrived, measuring distances in feet and minutes, working until her hands were warm and her breath even. When the rain finally came, it fell clean and steady, and Elena stood beneath the awning, watching the street darken and brighten at once, feeling present in a way she had not allowed herself before. Far across the water, Ragnar navigated changing winds with the same attention he gave to people, adjusting course without drama, trusting experience over impulse. He received reports from shore carried by fast boats, news of councils convened and customs reconsidered, and he read them without satisfaction or regret. The changes were not his to claim. They were simply necessary. At dusk, with the temperature dropping toward the low 50s, he stood with his officers and spoke plainly about standards, reminding them that authority endured when it protected dignity rather than demanding silence. The crew listened because his calm left no space for argument. Days later, Elena received another message, not delivered directly, but mentioned in passing by a traveler who spoke of the Viking king anchoring near a coastal town and calling for open counsel, inviting voices usually left outside the room. The traveler did not know Elena's interest, and she did not reveal it. She thanked him and returned to her work, aware that recognition did not require proximity to remain real. That evening, as the sky cleared, she walked along the riverbank, the water reflecting the first stars, and she felt the question that once haunted her finally settle into an answer. She belonged where she chose to stand, and the choice was renewed each day. The following week brought a gathering to the town square, not ceremonial, but practical, a meeting about routes and resources. Elena attended without expectation and spoke when it mattered, offering insight gained from miles walked and weather read with care. The room listened, not because she carried a title, but because clarity carried weight. When the meeting ended, a quiet respect followed her into the night, and she accepted it without letting it define her. Meanwhile, Ragnar's ship docked at the coastal town under a sky streaked with gold, the temperature a mild 60 degrees, and he stepped onto land with the same restraint he brought everywhere. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he asked questions that invited truth rather than compliance. Someone mentioned the Omega who had walked away weeks before, not as a curiosity, but as an example, and Ragnar did not correct the framing. He simply said that example mattered because it was honest. As night settled, Elena stood by the river once more, the current steady at her feet, and she sensed a familiar alignment, not of paths converging, but of values moving in parallel. The distance between them remained, purposeful and clean, and in that space both of them found what they needed, a recognition that did not fade with miles, and a respect that asked nothing more than to be lived. The town by the river shifted with the season, markets fuller, voices lighter, and Elena felt the subtle change as something earned rather than granted. She moved through her days with purpose, measuring time by the sun's angle and the steady tasks that needed doing, and people began to seek her judgment without ceremony. When storms threatened, she helped plan routes and shelter, counting miles and hours with an easy confidence. And when the weather cleared, she listened more than she spoke. It was not attention she wanted, but accuracy, and accuracy built trust quietly. One evening, with the air holding near 68 degrees and the river reflecting copper light, a council formed in the square to decide on a shared storehouse. Elena spoke once, suggesting placement above the flood line and access measured in minutes rather than pride, and the decision followed her reasoning without debate. She felt no triumph, only relief that clarity still mattered. Along the coast, Ragnar convened an open council beneath a canvas awning, the sea calm and blue beyond, the temperature mild enough to keep voices unhurried. He listened to fishers and traders, to elders and newcomers, and he set a standard without raising it like a banner. He said dignity was not an exception to be granted, but a baseline to be protected, and he repeated it until it no longer sounded like a lesson and began to sound like fact. When someone asked whether such openness weakened authority, he answered that fear was a poor foundation for any structure meant to last. The words traveled inland faster than boats, carried by mouths and memory, and Elena heard them without surprise. She recognized the shape of them because she had lived it. Days later, a messenger arrived at the town with a notice about a gathering to set shared routes between river and coast, practical and temporary, a meeting measured in outcomes rather than titles. Elena considered attending and decided to go, not because she was called, but because her presence would be useful. She traveled the 40 miles over 2 days, walking when the road allowed and riding when it did not, arriving as the morning warmed into the low 70s. The gathering was plain, tables set beneath open sky, maps weighted with stones, and when Elena took her place, no one questioned it. Ragnar arrived later, not announced, his attention settling across the maps and the people with the same calm he carried everywhere. He saw Elena without surprise and without claim, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement that asked nothing more. They worked the problem together without spectacle, aligning routes, calculating distances, agreeing on standards that favored safety over speed. When opinions clashed, they returned to facts, and facts held. As the sun climbed, the work concluded, and the gathering dissolved into conversations and departures. Elena stepped away toward the edge of the field, the grass warm underfoot, and Ragnar joined her at a respectful distance. He said the routes would hold because they were built by those who chose steadiness, and she agreed. He did not invite her anywhere, and she did not ask. Instead, they spoke of weather and timing, of how plans endured when they left room for people to remain whole. When they parted, it felt complete, not final. Elena returned to the river town with a lighter pack and a clearer sense of direction, and Ragnar turned back toward the coast, satisfied not with outcomes alone, but with the way they had been reached. As the days followed, the changes settled into habit, and Elena felt a quiet joy in knowing that what had begun as abandonment had become alignment, not because she had been taken in, but because she had been seen, and because seeing had been enough to change what needed changing. The season turned with a gentleness Elena had not expected, days lengthening, evenings cooling into the low 60s, and the river carrying its steady promise south. She settled into a rhythm that fit her, splitting time between work and travel, helping where clarity was needed, and stepping back when it was not. People learned to rely on her presence without leaning on it, and that balance felt like home. One evening, as the sky softened into rose and gray, a gathering formed by the water to mark the opening of the shared routes, not with ceremony, but with gratitude. Elena stood among them without being singled out, content to hear laughter and plans mingle, content to let usefulness speak for itself. Across the way, a small boat cut a quiet line toward the dock, its approach unannounced, and when Ragnar stepped onto the planks, the recognition moved through the crowd like a tide that did not rush. He greeted people by name, asked after weather and stores, and listened more than he spoke. When his gaze met Elena's, it held without claiming, and she felt the familiar steadiness settle where doubt once lived. They walked together along the bank as the light faded, the water reflecting the first stars, and Ragnar spoke of the councils that had followed, of standards adopted without spectacle, of how rooms changed when dignity was treated as fact rather than favor. Elena listened, understanding that outcomes mattered less than the way they were reached. She spoke of the town, of routes chosen for safety, of decisions made by those who would live with them, and Ragnar nodded, recognizing the same principle wearing different clothes. They stopped where the path widened and the river breathed, the temperature easing toward 58 degrees, the night calm. Ragnar said he would return north by morning, not because he was needed less, but because the work there had found its footing. Elena said she would continue south at first light, following the water until the land told her otherwise. Neither offered to change course. Instead, Ragnar said that seeing her had taught him what authority should protect, and Elena said that being seen had taught her that belonging did not require permission. The words rested easily between them because they asked nothing in return. As the stars brightened, Ragnar took a small token from his pocket, a simple compass worn smooth by use, and placed it on the stone beside the path, not as a gift to bind, but as a marker of trust. He said it pointed true when held steady. Elena accepted it without ceremony, understanding the language it spoke. They parted then, not with promises, but with a shared certainty that respect could travel farther than possession. Dawn came clear, the air crisp near 55 degrees, and Elena set out along the river, compass resting lightly in her pack, not because she needed direction, but because it reminded her of how she chose to move. From the ridge, Ragnar watched the town wake and felt no pull to intervene, only confidence in what had been set right. As miles grew between them, the alignment remained, not as a thread to be tugged, but as a horizon held in common. Elena walked on, steady and unclaimed, carrying the knowledge that abandonment had never defined her, and that being seen had changed not her worth, but the world's willingness to recognize it, a change that would continue quietly, one honest choice at a time.